The last video was interrupted, and so I have just a couple of quick points, and hopefully you can review what I was in the middle of saying when I was interrupted. We are talking about word size, and with the written word, the audience has the time to catch up. Really, the difference between the written word and the spoken word. You have the ability to use bigger words more often in written work than you do in spoken. When you're speaking, words run together, and for the listener especially, unless their listener is a very disciplined listener, words tend to tangle in the brain, and there's no rewind button, whereas with written work, the audience is able to look back over and review and even look up the words. Now, one more thing on this, and this is the point where I was interrupted. Don't be afraid to use a big word. Don't be afraid to use an unusual word. A good chef knows when to put in the pepper, but he also knows when to put in the paprika, the oregano, and the spices. If your audience doesn't know what you're talking about or what a particular word means, they can look it up, and if it bugs them, then they certainly will look it up, and that actually helps you in your ethos. The fourth element of style that affects voice and distance is qualifiers. Qualifiers are words like some, most, virtually, and so on. They're also called weasel words. They provide a way of lessening the impact of the direct, bold statement. The boss could say, "Show up for work on time," but he might not want to alienate his employees, or he might want to soften that command a little bit. And so he might say, "It would be good if some of you would work on showing up on time." All right, now he's still saying show up on time, but he's softened the impact. That's where the weasel comes in. It sounds nicer to say almost nobody shows up for work on time than to say nobody shows up early for work. Even if nobody does, still sounds nicer. And after all, we in this enlightened age are very concerned about how things sound. Listen to these two statements. The first more direct, the second heavily qualified. Let me read the example to you from Sharon Crowley's book. Let me make sure I have the right one. Okay. 3 months after announcing it had settled a lawsuit filed against it by Bread and Butter Corporation, the City Council of my town made the agreement public today. Okay, now there's a direct statement for you. Here is a second version of that statement. 3 long months after announcing it had tentatively settled one of the most expensive civil lawsuits in the city's history, today the City Council of my town, with some trepidation, made public a proposed agreement between it and the gigantic Bread and Butter Corporation. Now, you notice how heavily the second example is qualified. The first example sounds like a news release. No opinion, objective viewpoint, let the reader decide. The second, the author has clearly inserted some feeling, some passion, some emotion, and a viewpoint as well that is more subjective. Now, so far we've been arguing that the more direct statement is the more intimate statement, and yet in the examples that I just gave you, the more heavily qualified statement seems a more personal to the author, to the listener or the reader. So while the active voice decreases distance, we are now heading in the opposite direction with qualifiers. In this case, the more qualifiers, the more intimate. The more qualifiers in a statement, the more the audience identifies with the speaker or the writer. So active voice decreases distance, but then also an abundant use of qualifiers, heavily qualified statements, also decrease distance. And the reason is very simple. You sound friendly. Audiences identify with a friendly speaker. And so that's the advantage. The disadvantage is that weasel words indicate insecurity sometimes. They make you, or can make you, appear wishy-washy, as in the example that I gave a moment ago. Qualifiers can be a necessary evil. Sometimes, for the sake of accuracy, you must qualify what you say. And by the way, that statement was a very qualified statement. I use the word sometimes. So there's qualifiers, and the way qualifiers affect your ethos, particularly in the way of rhetorical distance. Now, the final element of style, the fifth element of style that affects voice and rhetorical distance, is punctuation. Now, on this one, you'll have to bear with me for a moment, because punctuation is not present or visibly present in written discourse. I'll explain, though, how in written discourse, I messed that up. Punctuation is not visibly present in oral presentations, in the spoken word. It is present, though, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Punctuation has different points of punctuation: commas, periods, dashes or hyphens, semicolons, colons. All those things have a powerful effect on the reader's perception of what you're writing and saying. And punctuation, of course, not just used correctly or incorrectly, but when you're putting in a comma, for instance, which is the most common punctuation besides the period, probably more common than the period. When you put in that punctuation, you're telling your audience how to interpret what you're writing. Punctuation is the written substitute for the pauses and the emotions in the spoken word. So it's not as if the spoken word is missing punctuation. When you pause for effect, when you pause too often, as I think I do, it has a rhetorical effect on your audience. It draws your audience in. And also the excitement in your voice, the expression on your face, your animation or lack of animation draws your audience in. Eye contact is an important element of identification between the speaker and the audience. And it makes your audience feel at home with you, or feel as if they're being lectured or spoken to but not talked with or discussed with. So we need to consider those things. There are many things that could be said on this issue that I am not going to say. But every kind of punctuation has a rhetorical effect on the audience. That's what you need to understand. And of course, in this modern age of text messaging, smileys also have a rhetorical effect. Now, I have, at this point in my life, up to this point in my life, refused to use smileys. But that's because I'm in my 40s, and to me, they come across as immature. And I believe that it is possible, without the use of smileys, to communicate your attitude and demeanor. But you do need to understand, the reason people use smileys today is it's a shortcut way of saying, this is my demeanor, this is my attitude on this subject. As much as I would like to think that I can communicate my demeanor or attitude on a particular subject, I still have received plenty of responses to both text messages and emails and written letters that tell me plainly the person I wrote to did not understand, or I did not communicate my demeanor or my attitude, and so it affected them, and in some cases offended them, or gave them an impression that I was angry when I was not, or that I was gleeful about something that I was not gleeful about. So a smiley is a sort of shortcut way of communicating your attitude, your demeanor on a particular subject. So it can be helpful to keep that in mind. Again, much could be said about, and much has been written, about the rhetorical effect of punctuation. I just want you to understand that with your punctuation, you're telling your audience, pause here. The parentheses says to your audience, I'm going to tell you something between you and me. And your audience gets that, understands that. It's the equivalent of something said in confidence. To a lesser degree, the hyphen and a hyphenated clause within a sentence has that same effect, the effect of speaking behind your hand. This is between you and me. And so on. I'm not going to go into all of that. You've seen enough about ethos for the time being. And that's all.